The train station was a ghost. Snow drifted through the empty platforms like a final prayer, soft and quiet and cold. No one dared to speak. Under the weak yellow eye of a single lantern stood a woman, still in her wedding dress, her breath pluming white in the dark. A bad start to any story, but for Mabel, this wasn't the start. It was the end, or so she thought. She didn't move when the train's whistle faded into a lonely cry against the hills. She didn't even blink when the last red light of the caboose was swallowed by the storm. Her carpetbag sat by her boots, its leather straps crusted with a thin armor of frost. She'd been standing there for the better part of an hour, a statue carved from disappointment, but her legs refused to carry her anywhere else. The satin of her dress was a poor shield against the wind, which bit at her skin with tiny, sharp teeth, as if to remind her she was still alive, still breathing, still abandoned. The station master, a short gray man named Silas, shuffled out from his office. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from pure worry. He pulled his wool coat tight, the fabric smelling of damp and coal smoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft as the falling snow, "you best come in out of the cold. Ain't no more trains comin' through tonight." She gave a small, stiff nod, but her feet stayed planted to the spot. Her whole life she had been told where to go, who to be. She was supposed to go with him, the man on the train, the man who never came. Somewhere out there, past the storm-drowned hills, he had made a choice, and his choice had left her here, a bride with no groom, a story with no ending. She imagined his letter, if he'd even bothered to write one, sitting on some polished desk, folded but unsent, a forgotten promise. "Ma'am," Silas said again, a little louder this time, a touch of impatience seeping into his tone. This time, Mabel moved. She bent, the movement stiff and painful, and lifted her bag. She followed him into the small, warm office, the smell of the glowing iron stove a welcome shock to her frozen senses. She lowered herself onto a hard wooden bench and set the bag at her feet. Her gloved hands, still pristine and white, lay folded in her lap like sleeping doves. Silas busied himself with the stove, tossing another log into its fiery belly. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Next train won't be by till mornin'," he said, his back still to her. "You'll freeze clean through if you sit out there waitin' all night. Ain't no man in this world worth losing your toes over." A tiny, brittle smile touched Mabel's lips. It hurt to move her face. "Thank you," she murmured, the words barely a whisper. And she wasn't sure if she meant it. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. And that was when she heard it. A cry. It was thin and desperate and raw, the kind of sound that bypasses the ears and goes straight for the heart. It pulled at something primal deep inside her chest, a chord of pure, unfiltered agony. The station door flew open with a gust of wind and snow, and a figure stepped inside. He was tall, dusted white from head to toe like a fence post in a blizzard. He was young, maybe 22, but grief had already carved deep, dark hollows under his eyes. A low-brimmed hat shadowed most of his face, but his mouth was set in a hard, grim line that belonged on a much older man. In his arms, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, was a small bundle, and from that bundle came the heartbreaking cry that had torn through the quiet night. He gave a single, curt nod to the station master, then sat down heavily on the bench directly across from Mabel. The baby's face was beet red from screaming, its tiny fists waving in the air as if trying to fight off the cold, the grief, the entire world. The young man began to rock the bundle with a steady, practiced motion, but the wailing didn't stop. It just grew louder, more frantic. Mabel couldn't help but stare. The man looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His boots were worn nearly through at the soles, and his coat was mended in 3 different places with mismatched thread. He was a man held together by sheer will and cheap string. Silas, sensing the crushing weight that had just entered the room, cleared his throat. "Coffee's on the stove," he announced to the heavy silence. "Help yourself." Mabel stood, grateful for something, anything to do. She poured a steaming cup of black coffee into a tin mug. She hesitated for a second, then poured a second one. She walked over to the stranger, her movements slow and deliberate, and set the cup on the bench within his reach. "Here," she said quietly. He glanced at the cup, then up at her. For a long moment, his dark eyes met hers, and she thought he might refuse. But he just gave another one of his short, sharp nods, shifting the screaming baby to one arm so he could reach for the coffee. He took a long, slow sip, the warmth seeming to do nothing to thaw the ice in his expression. "My boy's cried near all night, every night, since his mama passed," he said finally. His voice was low and gravelly, like he wasn't used to speaking much. "Guess grief don't take turns." The words hit Mabel with the force of a physical blow. She looked from his exhausted face to the tiny, struggling baby, his little chest heaving with each desperate cry. And in that moment, a tiny crack appeared in the wall of her own misery. This man's pain was real. It was raw and sharp and right here in front of her. It wasn't a phantom on a train, but a living, breathing sorrow. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words were true. They were the truest words she'd spoken all day. He just nodded again, as if that was all the answer the world required. They sat like that for a long, long time, the three of them, the abandoned bride, the grieving widower, and the crying child, while the storm hissed and spat against the window panes and the fire cracked and popped in the stove. The baby's cries slowly, mercifully, softened into small, uneven hiccups, until he finally, blessedly, drifted into a fitful sleep. Mabel's legs ached and her heart was a leaden weight in her chest, but something warm had begun to settle inside her. It was like the glow from the iron stove had found a way to creep under her skin. For the first time since the train had pulled away, leaving her alone on the platform, she wasn't thinking about the man who hadn't come. She was thinking about the man who had. When Silas finally turned in for the night, leaving the lantern burning low, Mabel stayed right where she was. The cowboy stayed too, one rough hand resting on the baby's back, his gaze fixed on the dying embers in the stove. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It felt like a thread, fine but strong, stretching across the small, warm room, connecting them in their shared loss. Mabel's fingers brushed against her carpet bag. She could take the morning train, go anywhere, disappear into some other town, and start again with nothing. Or she could stay here, in this hard wooden room, with a stranger and his child, and just see what the night made of them. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the window pane like a restless spirit. The baby stirred in his sleep, letting out a soft, plaintive whimper. The cowboy looked up then, his eyes meeting hers across the dim light. It was just one look, but it held a world of meaning. It wasn't a plea, not exactly. It was more like an invitation. Or maybe a question. Mabel drew in a breath, and it felt like the first real breath she'd taken all day. And as she looked at the stranger, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Not just grief, but fear. As she held his gaze, she noticed it for the first time. A fresh, deep scratch running along the back of his hand, from the knuckle to the wrist. It was red and angry, like it had been made by fingernails in a struggle. Her own hands flew to her mouth, a silent gasp. The warmth that had been building inside her turned to a sudden, chilling dread. His story was simple. A wife who had passed, a grieving son. But that scratch? That scratch didn't belong in a story of simple grief. That scratch belonged in a story of violence. What kind of grief don't take turns? Maybe the kind you cause yourself. The thought, ugly and sharp, pierced through the fog of her own sorrow. She looked from his haunted face to the sleeping baby, and then back to the angry red line on his hand. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just broken loose inside her. Who was this man? And what exactly was he running from? The air in the room grew thick, heavy with unspoken questions. The sleeping baby was a fragile piece of innocence between two adults drowning in secrets. His wife had passed, a gentle word for something that could be anything but. The night wore on, each tick of the station master's clock sounding like a hammer blow in the oppressive silence. The cowboy, Jesse, she'd heard Silas call him, never moved. his hand still resting on the baby, a gesture that now seemed less protective and more possessive. Mabel sat frozen on her bench, the simple offer of coffee she'd made earlier now feeling like a reckless act of trust. She had pitied him, but pity and fear were terrible neighbors. She thought about her bag, about the morning train, escape. But then she looked at the baby, Thomas, his face so peaceful in sleep, and her heart ached. What would happen to him? Finally, the first pale gray light of dawn began to creep through the grimy windows. The storm had quieted, leaving the world buried in a thick blanket of white. Mabel had dozed off, her head slumped against the wall, her wedding veil crushed under her cheek. She woke with a start to find Jesse already on his feet, his hat pulled low, the baby bundled tight against his chest. He was a shadow against the growing light. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, then nodded toward the door. "You got a place to go?" he asked. His voice was rough, thick with sleep or silence. Mabel hesitated. Her family was days away by train. The next one wasn't due until this afternoon. Pride, that stubborn, foolish thing, kept her from answering right away. But the truth was a cold, hard lump in her throat. "No," she whispered. He nodded, as if that was the answer he'd expected, as if that settled something for him. "My place is half an hour's ride out," he said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact. "Safer there than waitin' here. This snow ain't done with us yet." She blinked at him, startled by the offer, by the casual way he assumed she would go with him, a man with a secret scratched into his skin. I wouldn't leave a woman out here to freeze," he said, cutting off her unspoken protest. "Not with a baby." He added the last part as if it were an afterthought, but it hung in the air between them. There was no pity in his voice, no warmth, just a cold, hard logic that was somehow more unnerving than outright aggression. Just then, Silas emerged from his back room, his scarf half knotted around his neck. He took one look at the scene, at Jesse standing by the door, at Mabel frozen on the bench, and seemed to understand everything. He walked over, picked up her carpet bag, and pressed it into her hands. "Go on with him, ma'am," he advised, his voice low and urgent. "You'll get chilblains sittin' here another day." But as she took the bag, his eyes met hers, and they held a look she couldn't decipher. It was a warning, a clear and definite warning. "Just be careful," he murmured, so low she almost didn't hear it. So Mabel followed him. She followed the man with the scratched hand and the grieving eyes out into the sharp, clean morning. The air stung her lungs, each breath a painful reminder of where she was and who she was with. His horse, a big sorrel with frost clinging to its mane, waited patiently by the hitching post. He swung into the saddle with an easy grace, the baby still cradled in one arm, then reached down a gloved hand to her. She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was strong, firm, as he pulled her up to sit behind him. The leather of the saddle creaked under their combined weight. She was suddenly intensely aware of how close they were, her knees pressed against his thighs, the thin satin of her ruined dress brushing against his worn boots. They set off, the horse's hooves making soft, muffled thuds in the deep snow. The small town shrank behind them, becoming just a smear of smoke and rooftops against an endless canvas of white. The sky was a pale, flat gray, promising more snow to come. The only sounds were the rhythmic squeak of the saddle, the horses breathing, and the faint, fretful noises the baby made in his sleep. She found herself watching Jesse's hands on the reins. They were rough, calloused, but steady. The arm he kept curved protectively around the child never wavered. There was a solidness to him that warred with the fear coiling in her gut. This man was a walking contradiction, a gentle hand and a violent secret. "Does he have a name?" she asked, her voice sounding small against the vast silence. He nodded once. "Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, letting the name settle on her tongue. It was a good, strong name. "He looks like a Thomas." A corner of his mouth twitched, a faint ghost of a smile that never reached his eyes. "He's loud like one, too." The snow began to fall again, soft, thick flakes that melted on her eyelashes. By the time the cabin came into view, her fingers were numb and her mind was a whirlwind of suspicion and fear. It was a small, rough-hewn structure, smoke curling from a stone chimney, its roof piled high with snow. It looked lonely, isolated, a tiny outpost against the wilderness, a perfect place to hide, a perfect place to keep secrets. Inside, the air was blessedly warm. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the single room. A rough-hewn cradle stood near the fire, and on the back of a simple wooden chair hung a woman's shawl. It was a faded blue color. Mabel's throat tightened. The ghost of his wife was here. You could feel her in the silence, in the way the air held its breath. Jesse, she remembered Silas calling him Jesse, set the baby gently in the cradle and went to coax the fire higher. "There's beans on the stove," he said, his back to her. "Cornbread, too, if it ain't gone stale." Mabel peeled off her damp gloves, her fingers white and stinging as the warmth returned. She crossed to the stove and lifted the lid from the iron pot. The smell of beans and onion rose to meet her, warm and comforting, a simple, honest smell that felt out of place in this house of secrets. She ladled some into a tin bowl, then took a piece of cornbread from the pan. Jesse was sitting at the small table now, watching her. His dark, hollowed eyes followed her every move. She set a bowl in front of him before serving herself. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I wanted to," she replied, and it was true. Her hands needed something to do besides tremble. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scrape of their spoons against the tin bowls. The baby stirred, and Mabel rose without thinking and went to check on him. His face was softer now, his breathing even. She brushed a finger gently across his tiny, perfect knuckles. "He's warm," she said, her back still to Jesse, "but he's hungry, I think." Jesse nodded. He stood and fetched a tin cup from a shelf. "Cow's near dried up," he said, his voice grim. "Been watering down the milk. It ain't enough." Mabel glanced over her shoulder at him, at the tired slump of his shoulders, the weariness that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. "I know a few tricks," she said, surprising herself. "My mother kept 3 babies alive on less." He looked at her then, a long, measuring look, as if he were weighing more than just her words. And for the first time, something in his expression softened, a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or maybe it was relief. When the meal was done, Jesse banked the fire for the night. "You can take the bed," he said, gesturing to a simple cot in the corner. "I'll stay by the fire." Mabel opened her mouth to protest, but then she saw the stubborn set of his jaw and thought better of it. She sat on the edge of the cot, the mattress filled with lumpy corn husks, and stared at the blue shawl still draped over the chair. It felt like a trespass, sitting here, sleeping here, in a place where another woman had lived and breathed, in a place where another woman had died. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the chinks in the log walls. The baby whimpered, and Mabel instinctively crossed to the cradle. She laid a hand gently on his small chest, humming a soft tune until he quieted. When she looked up, Jesse was watching her from the hearth. His face was unreadable, half hidden in the shadows cast by the firelight. "Storm's settin' in again," he said softly. "Might be snowed in for a while." Mabel's breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but from the strange, heavy weight of the moment. She looked around the small cabin, at the cradle, at the fire, at the silent man who had brought her here, and a chilling realization washed over her. She might not be leaving this place anytime soon. She looked over at the small mantel above the fireplace. Amongst a few simple items, a tin of tobacco, a worn whetstone, was a small, silver-framed photograph, but it was lying face down, its secret hidden from the world. Why would a grieving husband hide a picture of his dead wife? Later that night, after Jesse had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep by the fire, his breathing slow and even, Mabel found she couldn't rest. The wind howled, and the cabin creaked and groaned around her like a ship in a storm. But it was the face-down photograph that kept her awake. It was a small thing, but it felt enormous, a deliberate act of concealment. She slipped out of the cot, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floorboards. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see by. She crept over to the mantel, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the frame. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself to go back to bed, but she couldn't. She lifted the frame. It was heavier than it looked. She took a deep breath and turned it over. The photograph was old, the edges faded and worn. It showed Jesse younger, smiling, a genuine, happy smile that reached his eyes. And beside him stood a woman, his wife. She was beautiful, with dark hair and a kind face, but it wasn't her face that made Mabel's blood run cold. It was the locket. Around the woman's neck, resting against the simple cotton of her dress, was a silver locket. It was heart-shaped, with a tiny, intricate rose engraved on the front. It was beautiful, and it was identical to the one Mabel had in her own carpet bag, the one her fiancé, Arthur, had given her just 3 months ago. The room tilted. It couldn't be. A coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. Lockets like that were common enough, weren't they? But this one, the way the light caught the engraving on the rose, it was exactly the same. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. She stumbled back to her bag, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unfasten the leather straps. She dug past her spare dress and her hairbrush until her fingers closed around the cool metal of the locket Arthur had given her. She pulled it out and held it up in the dim firelight next to the photograph. They were not similar. They were identical. A wave of nausea washed over her. What did this mean? How could Jesse's dead wife and her own fiancé have the exact same, very distinctive locket? The questions swirled in her mind, dark and terrifying. Was it possible they knew each other? The thought was absurd. Arthur was a wealthy businessman from the East. Jesse was a poor homesteader in the middle of nowhere. Their worlds could not have been further apart. And yet, the proof was right here, in her hands. A silver thread connecting her own shattered life to the tragedy that haunted this cabin. She looked at Jesse, sleeping so soundly by the fire. He looked almost peaceful in the soft glow of the embers, but the scratch on his hand seemed to pulse in the dim light, and the story he'd told her, of a wife who had passed, suddenly felt thin and fragile, a lie stretched taut over a terrible hidden truth. She sank down onto the cot, the photo in one hand, the locket in the other. The 2 silver hearts felt like weights, pulling her down into a sea of doubt and fear. She was trapped here, snowed in with a man whose secrets were tangled up with her own in a way she couldn't begin to understand. And the baby, Thomas, sleeping in his cradle, was at the center of it all. Who was he really? And what had happened to his mother? By the 3rd morning the sky had cleared, but the world was frozen solid. A hard crust of ice covered the deep snow, glittering under a pale, weak sun. Mabel rose early, her body sore, her mind a tangled mess of fear and suspicion. She found Jesse already outside, splitting firewood. The rhythmic thud of his axe was the only sound in the frozen world. His breath smoked in the frigid air as the axe rose and fell, steady and strong. For a moment she just watched him through the small cabin window, this man who was a complete mystery to her. Then she turned away. The baby was fussing. She warmed what little milk they had, her movements automatic, her thoughts a million miles away. She fed the baby, changed him, rocked him back to sleep. She had begun to think of the cradle as her responsibility, the one solid, understandable thing in this confusing new world. When Jesse came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, he didn't look at her. He looked past her, at their dwindling supplies on the shelf. "We need flour," he said, his voice flat. "And lamp oil. You up for a ride to town?" Mabel's stomach tightened into a knot. The thought of facing other people, of their curious stares and whispered questions, was terrifying. But the thought of staying here alone, with just her dark thoughts for company, was even worse. And something in his tone, a kind of challenge, told her he expected her to go. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. She tied her bonnet strings tight, a small, defiant gesture. The ride to town was silent and cold. The bright sun reflecting off the snow made her eyes water. When they arrived, the town's main street was rutted with sleigh tracks. People moved slowly, bundled in thick coats and scarves, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing to stare as Jessie pulled the horse to a halt in front of the mercantile. Conversations died. Heads turned. They stared at Jessie. Then their eyes moved to her, taking in her plain, mud-splattered dress, so clearly not the dress of a homesteader's wife, and her neatly pinned hair. Mabel kept her chin high, her back straight as they dismounted. She would not let them see her fear. She followed Jessie into the mercantile, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The store smelled of kerosene and coffee beans and dry goods. A woman with a sharp face and sharper eyes stood behind the counter. Mrs. Talbot, the storekeeper's wife. Her gaze flicked from Jessie to Mabel, and her mouth flattened into a thin, disapproving line. "Well," Mrs. Talbot said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she reached for her ledger. "Didn't expect to see you back in town so soon, Mr. Holt." Her eyes slid to Mabel again, a long, appraising look, before returning to Jessie. "Company out your way, I hear." Jessie's jaw tightened. "Need flour, lamp oil, and salt pork," he said, his voice even, betraying no emotion. Mrs. Talbot moved with deliberate slowness, taking her time gathering the items, making them wait, making them feel the full weight of her judgment. Mabel could feel the woman's eyes on her, could feel her mind working, adding it all up. A single man, a widower, a strange woman no one had ever seen before. Out in his isolated cabin. Her face burned with shame, though she told herself she owed these people no explanation. They didn't know her story. They didn't know anything. "Some folks have a habit of replacing things awful quick," Mrs. Talbot said, her voice just loud enough for Mabel to hear as she slammed the sack of flour onto the counter. The words were a slap in the face. She was insinuating that Mabel had replaced Jessie's dead wife. The injustice of it stung, hot and sharp. "A real shame what happened to Martha," the woman continued, her eyes fixed on Jessie. "A fall like that. So close to home." The meaning was clear. She wasn't just gossiping. She was accusing. Jessie placed a handful of coins on the counter, his movements stiff. "This will cover it." He didn't say another word. He grabbed the supplies and turned to leave. As they stepped back out onto the boardwalk, Mabel felt like every eye in town was on her. A whisper carried on the cold air, sharp enough to cut. "Shameful, livin' out there like that." Mabel flinched as if she'd been struck, but Jessie just kept walking, his face a stony mask, his hands steady on the reins of the horse. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her gloved fingers twisting in her lap. Halfway down the street, an older man in a long black coat stepped out from the church. His face was weathered but kind, his hair white at the temples. He lifted a hand in greeting. "Morning, Jessie, ma'am." It was the preacher. Jessie just tipped his hat in reply. The preacher's gaze softened when it landed on Mabel. "Hard winter for everyone," he said gently. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart. Don't let the whispers of idle tongues trouble you." Mabel swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. The words were meant to be a comfort, a balm, but they didn't stop the sting in her chest. Because how could they not be troubled? The ride back to the cabin was even quieter than the ride to town. The silence was different now, heavier, filled with the poison of the town's gossip. Mabel stared at the horizon, at the endless white landscape, until her throat ached. "Do they think?" she began, but she couldn't finish the sentence. "They think what they want to think," Jessie said flatly, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Let 'em." "It's me they're talking about," she said, a thread of anger weaving into her voice. "My reputation." His hands stayed steady on the reins. He turned to look at her then, his dark eyes intense. "No," he said. "It's us they're talking about." The word hung in the air between them. Us. She turned away, startled by the strange intimacy of it. When they reached the cabin, Mabel climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help. She went inside, her movements sharp and angry. She fed the baby. She stoked the fire. She tried to quiet the storm raging in her chest. She was no stranger to gossip, but this was different. This was sharper, more dangerous. Jesse came in a few minutes later, dusting snow from his shoulders. "They don't know you," he said finally, setting the supplies down on the table. "They don't need to know me to judge me," she shot back. He leaned against the table, looking at her from across the small room. "You want to leave?" he asked, his voice quiet. The question hit her like a splash of icy water. Did she? She thought of the cold, empty train station. She thought of the long, lonely track stretching out to nowhere. She thought of the baby's small fingers, how they had curled around hers in the night. And she thought of the locket, the impossible connection that tied her to this place, to this man. She had to know the truth. She couldn't leave until she knew. "No," she said at last, and the certainty in her own voice surprised her. "I don't want to leave." Something in Jesse's expression eased, just for a moment, a flicker of relief in his guarded eyes, before he turned to hang his coat by the door. Outside, the wind began to rise again, moaning through the pine trees. Mabel moved to the window and watched the snow begin to fall, a thick, swirling curtain that was quickly erasing their tracks, erasing the path back to town. A hush was settling over the land, isolating them once more. Behind her, the baby began to cry, and from near the hearth, Jesse's quiet voice came. "Storms come in fast out here," he said, "and this one's gonna be a big one." Mabel turned from the window, her heart thudding. She looked at Jesse, at the baby, at the faded blue shawl still draped over the chair. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging inside her. She was trapped. But a strange, reckless part of her wanted to be here. She wanted to see if they could weather it together. She wanted to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. As the snow fell harder, she looked at the face-down photograph on the mantel. She knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that the secret of the locket and the truth of what happened to Martha were hidden right here, within these four walls, and she would not leave until she found them. The snowstorm came on hard and fast, a furious white blizzard that smothered the world and silenced everything. By nightfall, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the shutters and shaking the small cabin to its foundations. Mabel set a pot of beans on the fire, the simple act a small anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. Jesse came in from the barn, his coat stiff with ice, his shoulders dusted with snow. He leaned his axe by the door and pulled off his gloves, his fingers red and raw. "Cows are huddled close," he said, his breath still quick from the effort of fighting his way through the storm. "We'll lose some feed if this keeps up." Mabel just nodded. She set a bowl for him at the table. "Eat," she said softly. "You've been out there for hours." He sat without a word, the lines of weariness etched deep around his mouth. She joined him, the small table forcing them close, their elbows nearly brushing. The storm shrieked outside, a terrifying, relentless sound, but inside the cabin, it was quiet. Just the crackle of the fire and the clink of their spoons. When the meal was done, Mabel cleared the table, humming a little tune under her breath without realizing it, a song her mother used to sing. The soft sound filled the small space, and Jesse paused by the hearth, listening. "You sing pretty," he said at last. She flushed, startled that he'd noticed, that he'd listened. "I used to sing to my sisters," she said, her voice quiet. The baby began to fuss, and she went to the cradle, lifting him into her arms. She tucked him against her shoulder, swaying back and forth, humming her mother's lullaby, low and steady, until his tiny body relaxed and his breathing slowed. When she looked up, Jesse was still watching her, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A stranger who had invaded his home, taken over his dead wife's tasks, or something else. Later, after the baby was asleep in his cradle, Jesse sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Mabel watched him for a long time before she set another log on the fire and saw that his head was in his hands, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter despair. Something about his silent grief made her cross the room and crouch near him. She poured coffee into a tin cup and set it by his side. He looked at the cup, then up at her. "You don't have to keep doing that," he said, his voice thick. "Doing what?" she asked. "Acting like you belong here." The words were a punch to the gut. She sat back on her heels, her pulse quickening. "Maybe I do," she whispered. His dark, searching gaze held hers. "I buried her 3 weeks ago," he said finally, and the words seemed to crack the air between them. "Right under that big cottonwood out back. I thought if I just worked hard enough, I wouldn't hear her name in every quiet corner of this room. But it ain't workin'." Mabel's throat tightened with a sympathy that was dangerously close to something else. She reached out, her hand hovering over his, then let it fall back into her lap. "I was supposed to marry a man who never got on the train," she said, the words tumbling out of her. "My father's money wasn't enough to keep him, and now every tongue in 3 counties will know I was left standing in my wedding dress." The wind howled, a mournful chorus to their shared confessions. For a moment they just sat there, 2 strangers bound by shame and sorrow. "You didn't deserve that," Jesse said quietly. "Neither did you," she replied. He gave a short, humorless huff of breath. "Guess neither of us got what we deserved." The baby stirred, and Mabel rose to rock the cradle. Jesse watched her, his expression softer now, the hard edges worn away by his confession. The next day the storm raged on, trapping them, forcing them into a strange, intimate proximity. Mabel found a pile of mending and set to work, the simple act of stitching torn fabric back together a quiet comfort. Jesse worked near the window, carving new pegs for the barn door, the scrape of his knife a steady, patient sound. Each time their eyes met, something unspoken, a fragile understanding, passed between them. That night, for the first time, the baby slept soundly through the night. Mabel woke near dawn, startled by the profound silence. She saw Jesse sitting by the fire, his hat on his knee, his shoulders slumped. She rose quietly, wrapping a blanket around herself, and sat on the hearth opposite him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "Feels strange. The house is too quiet." She warmed the coffee from the night before, and they sat in silence, sipping from their tin cups. The fire painted his face in shades of gold and shadow, softening the tired lines around his eyes. "I didn't reckon I'd need someone again so soon," he said after a long, heavy pause, his gaze fixed on the flames. Her chest tightened. "Maybe," she said, choosing her words carefully, "maybe we just needed each other at the same time." He looked at her then, a long, searching look, and the silence that followed felt like an answer. The wind had finally died down. Somewhere beyond the hills the sun was beginning to rise. Jesse stood, crossed to the cradle, and laid his rough hand gently on the baby's chest. "He's breathing easy," he said, his voice filled with a kind of reverence. Mabel swallowed against the sudden lump in her throat. Something fragile but real had sparked between them in the heart of the storm. Something true. It felt like a new beginning. And then, from outside, a sound cracked the morning silence. A loud, sharp snap, like a heavy branch breaking under the weight of the snow. Jesse was at the window in an instant, peering out into the moonlit yard. His body went tense. "Tracks," he said, his voice low and tight. "Somebody's been out here." His words hung in the air like smoke. Mabel rushed to the window and stood beside him, peering out into the blue-white twilight of dawn. The snow was a pristine, untouched blanket, gleaming under the last of the moonlight. Except it wasn't untouched. A single set of footprints led from the dark line of the trees, circled the cabin, and then went toward the barn. "Could be a coyote," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Coyotes don't wear boots," he said grimly. His hand went to the rifle that was always propped by the door. His fingers wrapped around the cold steel. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument, and locked the door behind me. Before she could protest, the baby whimpered, a thin, frightened sound. She scooped him out of the cradle and held him tight against her chest, rocking him as Jessie slipped out the door. The heavy wooden bolt sliding into place sounded deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. The cabin, which had started to feel like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She whispered a prayer her mother used to say, her words a frantic murmur in the quiet room. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then she heard Jessie's voice from outside, sharp and low. "Mabel!" She fumbled with the bolt and threw the door open, the frigid air slapping her face. Jessie stood near the barn, his rifle lowered, and in the snow by the fence lay a man, clutching his ankle, his breath puffing white as he cursed. Jessie had caught him, but as she got closer, she saw the man's face. It was gaunt, his coat threadbare, and his eyes. There was a desperation in them that eclipsed any malice. "Caught him trying to lift some feed," Jessie said, his voice hard, "but he's no thief I've ever seen." "Ain't looking for trouble," the man rasped, his voice hoarse with pain and cold. Just trying to keep my kids from starving." Mabel's throat tightened. She looked at Jessie and saw the conflict in his face, the anger of a man whose property had been threatened, warring with the understanding of a man who knew what it was to be desperate. "Bring him in," she said, the words coming out before she'd even thought them through. "He'll freeze to death out here." Jessie hesitated for a second, then gave a curt nod. Together they half carried, half dragged the man inside and lowered him into a chair by the fire. His worn-out boots began to steam as the warmth touched them. Mabel ladled a bowl of beans and handed it to him. He ate like a wolf, his hands shaking, not pausing for breath until the bowl was empty. When he was done, he sagged back in the chair, his eyes closing in exhausted relief. "Tracks will be covered by morning," Jessie said, setting the rifle aside. "He can go when the sun's up." Mabel nodded, though a part of her ached for the man's children, wherever they were. She laid another log on the fire, then sank onto the cot, suddenly bone-tired. The man dozed by the hearth, the baby slept in his cradle, and the cabin settled into a weary peace. Jessie sat across from her, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "You could have turned him out," he said quietly. She looked at him. "So could you." A faint smile touched her lips. "Maybe I didn't want to be the kind of woman who leaves a man to die in the snow." His gaze lingered on her, thoughtful. "You've got more grit than most," he said. Mabel stared into the fire, the warmth loosening the tight knot of fear in her chest. She felt the weight of every choice that had led her to this moment. "Jessie," she said softly, her voice steady, "I can leave when the snow clears, if that's what you want." He looked at her sharply, as if the idea startled him. "You want to leave?" She glanced at the cradle, at the baby's small fist curled near his mouth. She thought of the locket, still hidden in her bag. She couldn't leave yet, not until she knew. "I thought I did," she admitted. "But now—" She swallowed. "Now it feels like I was meant to end up here." Something shifted in his face, like a lock clicking open. He stood, crossed the small room, and stopped in front of her. "This cabin's too quiet without you in it," he said, the words rough but certain. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. "And too cold without him," she answered, nodding toward the cradle. He reached down, his hand brushing against hers, a light, tentative touch. She didn't pull away. She let her fingers curl around his. Just then, the man by the fire stirred. He blinked his eyes open, looking dazed. "Thank you," he mumbled, looking from Mabel to Jessie. "Thank you both. I never meant no harm." "Get some rest," Jessie said, his voice softer now. The man nodded, but then he looked at Jessie, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're Holt, ain't you?" "Jessie Holt?" Jessie nodded. The man's expression changed. A flicker of fear or maybe recognition crossed his face. "I heard about your wife," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A terrible accident. Terrible." He paused, then added, "Almost as terrible as what happened to that fella she used to know. The one from back east." Mabel's blood turned to ice. She felt Jesse's hand tense in hers. "What fella?" Jesse asked, his voice dangerously low. The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Don't know his name. Just heard talk. Martha knew him before she met you. They say he came back looking for her a month or so ago. Then he just disappeared. Right around the same time she had her accident." The man's eyes darted towards the axe still leaning by the door, then back to Jesse's face. The implication was clear, hanging in the air like a thick, choking smoke. A man from Martha's past. A man who had disappeared. The stranger's words echoed in the sudden, terrible silence of the cabin. A man from the east. Disappeared. Right around the time Martha died. Mabel felt Jesse's hand go rigid in hers. She pulled her own away slowly. The fragile connection they had just forged shattered into 1,000 pieces. She looked at Jesse, really looked at him, and saw not a grieving widower, but a man with a darkness in his eyes she had never seen before. The stranger, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, began to stammer. I don't mean nothing by it. Just town talk. You know how people are." "Get out," Jesse said, his voice a low growl. "But the storm," the man protested. "I said, get out," Jesse roared, taking a step toward him. The man scrambled to his feet, his injured ankle forgotten, and hobbled out the door, disappearing into the swirling snow without a backward glance. The door slammed shut, leaving Mabel and Jesse alone in the suffocating silence. "Town talk," Jesse spat, turning away from her, his back a wall of fury. "It's nothing but lies." But Mabel's mind was racing, fitting the pieces together. The locket. A man from the east. Her fiancé, Arthur, was from the east. He had given her an identical locket. He was the man who was supposed to be on that train. The man who had abandoned her. What if he hadn't just abandoned her? What if he had come here first? What if he had come looking for Martha? "Jesse," she said, her voice shaking. "The man I was supposed to marry. His name was Arthur." Jesse froze. He turned around slowly, his face a pale, taut mask. "What did you say?" "His name was Arthur," she repeated, her heart hammering. She stumbled over to her carpet bag and pulled out the locket, holding it up. "He gave me this." Jesse stared at the locket in her trembling hand, then his eyes shot to the mantel, to the face-down photograph. With 2 long strides, he was there. He snatched up the frame and stared at the image of his wife, at the identical locket around her neck. A low, ragged sound escaped his lips. "He was here," Mabel whispered, the terrible truth dawning on her. "Arthur was here, wasn't he?" Jesse didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the photograph, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame. "What happened to him, Jesse?" she pressed, her voice rising with a frantic urgency. "What happened to my fiancé?" "He came here," Jesse said finally, his voice hollow, dead. "He came here running his mouth, making demands, said Martha was his, said the baby was his." The ugly words filled the small cabin, poisoning the air. Mabel felt a wave of dizziness. Thomas? Arthur's son? "He said he was taking them both back east with him," Jesse continued, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "He said Martha never loved me." "Where is he now, Jesse?" Mabel demanded, stepping closer to him. "What did you do?" He finally looked at her, and his eyes were black holes of despair. "We argued. In the barn. Martha came out. She tried to stop us. She told him to leave. He wouldn't listen. He grabbed her." Jesse's voice broke. "He pushed her. She fell. She fell against the ladder to the hayloft. It was an accident." An accident. The same word Mrs. Talbot had used, but this was a different story. A story with a villain. A story that might just be the truth. "And Arthur?" Mabel whispered. "What happened to Arthur?" Jesse's gaze dropped to the floorboards. "He ran," he said. "After she fell, he just ran." Like the coward he is. I went to Martha, but it was too late. By the time I looked up, he was gone. The story was plausible. It explained everything. The town gossip, the whispers about a man from the east, Arthur's failure to show up at the train station. He had caused Martha's death and fled, leaving Jessie to take the blame, leaving Mabel to be abandoned. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. Jessie wasn't a murderer. He was a victim, just like her. She reached out and touched his arm. "I believe you," she said softly. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope. And in that moment, she did believe him. She wanted to believe him. But as he stood there, bathed in the soft light of the fire, she saw something. A dark stain on the cuff of his shirt, one he usually kept rolled up. A stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The relief vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. He'd said Arthur ran. But if he ran, where did the blood come from? Her gaze flickered from the stain on his cuff down to the floor. And that's when she saw it. Near the hearth, where he had been sleeping for nights, one of the floorboards was slightly uneven. A corner of it raised just enough to be noticeable if you were looking for it, a hiding place. Her blood ran cold. The story was too neat, too perfect. It explained everything away, leaving Jessie as the blameless hero. But what if it was a lie? What if the argument in the barn had ended differently? What if Martha's fall hadn't been an accident? And what if Arthur hadn't run away at all? What if he was still here? The floorboard, the blood, the lies, they were all piling up. She had to know. Later that night, as Jessie slept the sleep of the emotionally exhausted, Mabel crept from her cot. The storm had started up again, its fury a perfect match for the turmoil in her heart. She knelt by the hearth, her hands trembling. She used the tip of a small knife to pry at the edge of the loose floorboard. It lifted easily, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. The space smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet. The smell of old blood. Her fingers brushed against something cold and hard, a man's belt buckle. She pulled it out. It was heavy, silver, with the initial A engraved in the center. Arthur's. And then she found the journal. It was small, bound in worn leather. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was Martha's diary. The first entries were filled with love for Jessie, joy about the baby. But the tone began to change a few weeks ago. Fear crept into the elegant script. Fear of a man from her past. Arthur. He had found her. He was threatening her. He wanted money. He was claiming the baby was his. Then, the last entry. It was dated the day she died. "Arthur was here again," she wrote. "He is mad with jealousy. He said if I don't leave Jessie and come with him, he will ruin us. He will tell everyone the baby is his, whether it's true or not. He will tell them Jessie is a violent man. He is waiting in the barn. He says he will not leave without me. I am so afraid. I am going to tell Jessie everything. He will protect us. He must." Mabel's breath hitched. So Jessie's story was partly true. Arthur was here. He was threatening Martha. But the diary ended there. It didn't say what happened in the barn. It didn't explain the fall. It didn't explain what happened to Arthur. She read the last line again. He will protect us. He must. Had he protected her? Or had he, in a fit of rage and jealousy, silenced both her and her tormentor forever? A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Jessie was standing there, a dark silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. His face was a mask of stone. "You shouldn't have read that," he said, his voice flat and cold. The man she had felt pity for, the man she had started to feel something more for, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a keeper of dark secrets, and maybe a killer. "Where is he, Jessie?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Where is Arthur?" He didn't answer. He just took a step toward her, his eyes unreadable, his expression grim, and Mabel knew with a terrifying certainty that she was trapped in a cabin with a murderer, and that the biggest storm was not outside but right here in this room. The air crackled with tension. The howling of the wind outside was no match for the roaring silence in the cabin. Jesse took another step closer, his shadow looming over her. Mabel scrambled backward, clutching the diary to her chest like a shield. "He's buried out there, isn't he?" she breathed, the horrific realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. With her. Jesse's face contorted, not with rage, but with a deep, soul-crushing anguish. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he rasped, his voice breaking. "He came at me. He was insane, shouting that he'd kill me, that he'd take Martha and the boy and I'd never see them again." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his whole body trembling. "Martha ran between us. He shoved her. He didn't mean to. But she was so small. She fell back against the ladder, and it just gave way. The rung snapped." He looked at Mabel, his eyes pleading for her to understand, to believe him. She was gone. Just like that. I looked at him, and all I could see was red. He killed her. His jealousy, his madness. It killed her. He choked on a sob. "I picked up a shovel. I didn't even think. I hit him, and I kept hitting him." The confession hung in the air, ugly and brutal. He wasn't the victim in this story. He was the executioner. "I buried him," he whispered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Out in the woods, where no one would ever find him. I told myself it was justice, an eye for an eye, but it wasn't justice. It was just hate." He looked so broken, so utterly destroyed, that for a wild second Mabel felt a surge of pity. But then she looked at the sleeping baby, an innocent child whose father had been murdered and buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. "You lied to me," she said, her voice cold as ice. "You let me believe you were a victim. You let me care about you." "I was afraid," he said, his voice ragged. "I saw the way you looked at Thomas. I saw you bringing this house back to life. I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to lose you." His words, which might have once touched her heart, now felt like poison. He hadn't seen her as a person. He'd seen her as a replacement, a convenient solution to his problems, a mother for his child and a woman to warm his bed, all built on a foundation of lies and murder. Suddenly, a loud, frantic banging on the cabin door made them both jump. A man's voice, muffled by the thick wood and the storm, shouted from outside, "Holt! Jesse Holt! Open up! It's the sheriff!" The sheriff? The law had come. Someone must have seen something. Maybe the hungry stranger had gone straight to town. Maybe the town's gossip had finally solidified into a formal accusation. Jesse's face went white. He looked at Mabel, his eyes wide with panic. "Please," he begged. "Mabel, please don't tell him. We can make this work. Me, you, the boy. We can be a family." The offer was ludicrous, insane. A family built on a bedrock of murder? The banging came again, louder this time. "Open this door, Holt, or I'm breaking it down!" Jesse looked from the door to Mabel, his mind racing. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "Tell him you're my wife," he hissed, his voice desperate. "Tell him the stranger was lying. Tell him anything. Just don't let him take me." Mabel looked into his eyes and saw the raw, selfish terror of a man caught in his own trap. He didn't care about her. He only cared about saving himself. In that moment, all the pity, all the fragile affection she had felt for him curdled into a hard, cold resolve. She would not be his shield. She would not be an accomplice to his crimes. She wrenched her arm from his grasp. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. The cabin door burst open, splintering off its hinges. The sheriff stood on the threshold, a big, barrel-chested man with a grim face, snow swirling in around him. And standing right behind him, her face a mask of cold fury, was Mrs. Talbot from the Mercantile. Mrs. Talbot's sharp eyes swept the room, taking in Mabel, the diary clutched in her hand, and Jesse's terrified face. "I told you, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with grim satisfaction. "I told you something wasn't right out here. He's had this poor girl held captive." The sheriff's gaze settled on Jesse. "Jesse Holt, you're under arrest for the murder of Arthur Penhaligon." Jesse stared, dumbfounded. How did you know?" The sheriff nodded toward Mrs. Talbot. "Mrs. Talbot here is a bit of a town historian. She remembered your wife, Martha, writing letters to a cousin back east a few years ago. Mentioned a man named Arthur Pent something. When a man matching his description checked into the hotel a month back, asking questions about you, and then disappeared the same week your wife had her accident, she got to thinking. I knew he was no good," Mrs. Talbot said, her arms crossed over her chest. "Martha was my sister's girl, my niece. She wrote to me when that devil Arthur came back into her life. I told her to run. I guess she didn't listen." The revelation hit Mabel like a physical blow. Mrs. Talbot wasn't just a town gossip. She was Martha's aunt. Her hostility hadn't been judgment. It had been a strange, twisted form of grief and protection. The sheriff stepped forward, pulling out a pair of iron handcuffs. "It's over, Jesse." But Jesse wasn't looking at the sheriff. He was looking at Mabel, his face a canvas of betrayal and disbelief. He had been so sure she would protect him, so sure she would choose his side. He had misjudged her completely. As the sheriff clamped the cold metal around his wrists, Jesse lunged, not at the lawman, but toward the cradle. "He's my son!" he screamed, his voice raw with a desperate paternal love that was perhaps the only true thing about him. "You can't take him from me!" The sheriff and Mrs. Talbot wrestled him back, dragging him toward the door. Jesse fought them, his eyes wild, fixed on the crying baby. Mabel rushed to the cradle and scooped Thomas into her arms, shielding him from the awful scene. As they dragged Jesse out into the storm, he twisted his head, his last, desperate words aimed at Mabel. "You did this!" he shrieked, his voice swallowed by the wind. "You'll regret this!" And then he was gone. The cabin was suddenly, blessedly silent, except for the baby's frightened sobs and the crackling of the fire. Mabel stood in the middle of the room, shaking, holding the child who had been at the center of this terrible storm. Mrs. Talbot came back inside, her hard expression softening as she looked at Mabel and the baby. "You're safe now," she said, her voice gentler than Mabel had ever heard it. She walked over and looked down at Thomas, a sad, knowing smile on her face. "He has Martha's eyes," she said softly. The sheriff followed her in, stamping snow from his boots. His gaze was kind, full of a weary sympathy. "Ma'am," he said to Mabel, "we'll need a statement from you back in town, and we'll need to figure out what's to be done about." He trailed off, nodding toward the baby. What was to be done? Thomas had no one. His mother was dead. His biological father was dead, and the man who had raised him, loved him, was a murderer on his way to prison. He was an orphan, a piece of wreckage left behind by the storm. Mabel looked down at the tiny, innocent face, at the small fists clutching at her dress. She thought of her own empty future, of the life that had been stolen from her. She had come to this town to start a new life as a wife and, one day, a mother. That life was gone, but maybe a different one was just beginning. She looked up, first at Mrs. Talbot, then at the sheriff. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, filled with a purpose she hadn't felt in her entire life. "He's staying with me," she said. The days that followed were a blur. Mabel gave her statement to the sheriff, the whole ugly story tumbling out under the dim lights of his office. The town, which had been so quick to judge her, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and awe. She was the woman who had been jilted at the station, held captive by a murderer, and had emerged from the ordeal with a baby in her arms. She was a local legend before she'd even been there a week. Mrs. Talbot, her aunt-in-law of a sort, proved to be an unlikely ally. She helped Mabel get settled in a small rented room above the Mercantile. She brought blankets and food and clothes for the baby. Her sharp edges had been worn away, revealing a core of tough, pragmatic kindness. "Martha would have wanted him to have a good mother," she said one afternoon, watching Mabel rock Thomas to sleep. "Looks like he found one." The cabin was sealed, a crime scene waiting for the spring thaw when the sheriff and his men could find Arthur's body. Mabel never wanted to see the place again. It was a tomb, filled with the ghosts of violent secrets. Her new life was here, in this small, clean room, with the gurgling baby and the steady rhythm of the town moving below her window. She used the last of her money to buy fabric, and she began to sew. She made shirts for the local ranchers and dresses for their wives. Her stitches were neat and strong, and soon she had a steady stream of work. She fell into a new routine. Waking with the sun, feeding Thomas, sewing by the window, walking with the baby bundled against her chest in the cold, clean air. The shame of being an abandoned bride faded, replaced by the fierce, protective love she felt for this child. He was not hers by blood, but he was hers by circumstance, by choice. He was hers by heart. One evening, the preacher came to call. He sat in the single chair in her small room, his kind eyes filled with a gentle concern. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, watching her soothe the fussy baby. "You have taken on a great burden, my child." "He is not a burden," Mabel said, her voice soft but firm. "He is a blessing." The preacher smiled. "Indeed. The town council has been discussing what is to become of Jesse Holt's property, his land and livestock, once the legal matters are settled. Considering the circumstances, considering your role in raising his son, they have agreed that it should all pass to you." Mabel stared at him, stunned. The land, the cabin, the livestock, a future, a home. "It will be a hard life," the preacher cautioned, "running a homestead on your own." Mabel looked down at Thomas, at his perfect, sleeping face. She thought of the hard-won peace she had found in this small town, of the strength she had discovered within herself. She was not the same woman who had stood freezing on that train platform. That woman was gone. "I am not on my own," she said. When spring finally came, melting the snow and turning the world green again, Mabel, with the help of a few hired hands paid for by Mrs. Talbot, moved back to the homestead. The cabin had been aired out, scrubbed clean, every trace of Jesse Holt and his dark secrets erased. She planted a garden. She bought more chickens. She learned to milk the cow. She worked from sunup to sundown, her body aching, her hands calloused, but her heart full. Thomas grew, learning to crawl on the clean-swept floorboards, his happy shrieks filling the rooms that had once held so much sorrow. One day, the sheriff rode out to see her. He told her that Jesse Holt had been convicted, that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. He had never shown a flicker of remorse, only a bitter resentment toward the woman who had refused to be his salvation. Mabel felt a brief, sad pang, not for the man he was, but for the man he might have been. Then she let it go. He was a part of her past, a ghost from a different life. The years passed. Thomas grew into a strong, kind boy, with his mother's eyes and Mabel's steady heart. The homestead flourished under her care. She never remarried. She had found her family, forged not by vows or by blood, but in the heart of a winter storm. She was no longer defined by the man who had left her or the one who had lied to her. She was Mabel, a mother, a homesteader, a survivor. She had built a life, a real and true and beautiful life, out of the ashes of two broken ones. Her story hadn't ended at that train station. It had begun. What city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. If you believe that even the most difficult beginnings can lead to beautiful destinations, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove it. Thank you for watching.